In the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, Plato stated that beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that is, Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean, there once existed a vast island called Atlantis, which was 3,000 stadia long, approximately 540 kilometers, and 2,000 stadia wide, about 360 kilometers. Then, as a result of a natural catastrophe, this island sank beneath the waves. For several centuries, people have attempted to find the remnants of the island described by Plato and, importantly, the great civilization that existed on it. Initially, seekers focused on searching for the island in the Atlantic Ocean, where several locations for the possible whereabouts of Atlantis were identified. The Azores were considered the most likely site, with Atlantis thought to be a former landmass of the mid-Atlantic ridge. However, once it was established that this ridge had submerged over 200 million years ago, this idea was abandoned. Next, Atlantis was located near the Canary Islands, where the Guanche people, who inhabited these islands in the past, were interpreted as descendants of the Atlanteans. Searches extended to areas around Ireland and between Portugal and Madeira. Yet nothing resembling a sunken giant island could be found, leading these searches to broaden to other regions of the world. The island of Santorini in the Mediterranean Sea, which experienced a volcanic eruption several hundred years before Plato, was a candidate for Atlantis, as were Snake Island in the Black Sea and Antarctica, which was thought to have shifted to the southern pole due to tectonic movements. Atlantis was sought in the Andes, Brazil, and many other places. However, all searches were in vain, and nothing resembling the remnants of a great civilization was discovered. During these quests, the field of Atlantology even emerged, and the topic of Atlantis gained significant popularity in pseudoscientific and occult mystical circles. Well, let's join these searches as well. I believe the first step is clear. We must turn to the original sources, the dialogues of Plato. Both dialogues describe a conversation between Socrates, the Pythagorean Timaeus, the general Hermocrates, and Plato's uncle, Critias. In the dialogue Timaeus, the host, Critias, recounts a story he heard from his grandfather, Critias the Elder, who was a distant relative of Solon. This story was supposedly told to Critias the Elder by Solon himself, who recounted his conversation with Egyptian priests. According to the Egyptians, 9,000 years before Solon, there was a war between Athens and Atlantis, located on a vast island in the Atlantic Ocean. The Athenians, thanks to their valor, defeated the Atlanteans and liberated the nations enslaved by them. However, shortly after this, a grand natural catastrophe occurred, causing Atlantis to sink to the bottom of the sea, while in Athens a flood washed away all the fertile soil. The following dialogue, Critias, is almost entirely devoted to describing these events. According to Critias, before the flood, Athens was inhabited by a virtuous people who enjoyed an ideal social order. The country was governed by rulers and warriors who lived on the Acropolis as a communist community, separate from the agrarian and artisan masses. The soil was extremely fertile, and the citizens lived in prosperity and harmony. Opposing Athens was Atlantis, a huge island in the Atlantic Ocean, 3,000 stadia long and 2,000 stadia wide. The progenitor of the Atlanteans was the god Poseidon, who took a mortal woman as his consort and fathered 10 sons. The eldest son, Atlas, became the king of the island, while the other 9 received portions of the island and became archons. At the center was a city located a few kilometers from the coast, surrounded by 3 rings of water. Bridges were built over these rings, and canals were dug, allowing ships to approach the central island. The walls around the outer ring were made of bronze, the inner embankment was covered in tin, and the wall around the central island was made of a mysterious metal called orichalcum, which emitted a fiery brilliance. In the center stood a temple of Poseidon, with silver walls, a golden roof, an ivory ceiling, and orichalcum walls. As long as the Atlanteans retained their divine nature and disregarded wealth, prioritizing virtue above all, Atlantis prospered. However, when their divine nature deteriorated, and the Atlanteans became mired in luxury, greed, and pride, Zeus decided to punish them. And here, at the most intriguing moment, the manuscript ends. This story is filled with fantastical details that immediately suggest it is unlikely to be an account of real historical events and facts. So what is this tale about? Let's recall what Plato said in other dialogues. Alongside his teachings on eternal and indestructible ideas as the foundation of existence, the soul, and knowledge, Plato's primary focus is the theory of the state and the search for an ideal political system. It is likely that these inquiries were prompted by the fate of his teacher, Socrates, who was sentenced to death by the Athenian mob that had come to power through the democratic system of Athens. This suggests that the democratic structure of the state, which fosters ignorance, frivolity, and extravagance, is flawed. Similarly, both oligarchy and tyranny, which lead to complete moral corruption, are also incorrect forms of governance. It was necessary to create a state where philosophers would not be executed, but would be treated with the respect and obedience their decisions deserved. Essentially, a state where power and philosophy are united in a single authority. Plato proposed elements of this model in various dialogues, but he articulated it most coherently in The Republic. In his view, a well-organized state should consist of three classes: the philosophers who rule, the guardians who protect, and the workers who provide for the society. The latter category includes farmers, artisans, and traders. The primary criterion for determining a person's class is the state of their soul. Philosophers possess a dominant rational part, guardians have a dominant spirited part, and workers have a dominant appetitive part. Workers live like all contemporary people to Plato, having private property, families, and children. The rulers and guardians are equal to one another. All share meals at the same table, and all property is communal, including wives and children, with rulers arranging temporary marriages solely to ensure good heredity for their offspring. This is how ancient Athens is depicted in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias. Thanks to this structure, the citizens of Athens lived in prosperity and harmony. Of course, I could be mistaken, but it seems to me that a real Atlantis never existed, and Plato's account of it is more of a parable, a literary device. Plato aimed to convey the simple idea that being virtuous is better than succumbing to the temptations of the world, and that true prosperity for a people can only be ensured by the right form of government, such as that which existed in Athens before the Great Flood. However, wait a moment. Seekers of the real Atlantis insist that Plato's description of Atlantis is far from the only account. Stories about it can be found in the works of many ancient authors. Most often, this refers to historians Herodotus, Diodorus, and Aelian, the scholar and geographer Strabo, as well as the Neoplatonist philosopher Proclus. Indeed, Herodotus, who lived in the 5th century BC, reported on the Atlanteans long before Plato, which adds particular value to his information, as he could not have been influenced by Plato's account. In the 4th book of his monumental work, Herodotus describes the Atlas Mountains, stretching from the shores of Morocco to Tunisia. He referred to the local inhabitants as Atlanteans, since they derived their name from the mountains. Clearly, these Atlanteans have nothing to do with Plato's Atlantis, apart from the similarity in names. Diodorus of Sicily, a 1st century BC author, mentions the Atlanteans several times, including once in relation to their war with the mythical Amazons and At another point, when discussing the tribes of North Africa living near the Atlas Mountains, information he undoubtedly borrowed from Herodotus. Finally, in Book 5, he vividly retells Plato's account of Atlantis without adding anything new. The scholar and geographer Strabo, who lived at the turn of the era, comments on the work of the 2nd century BCE scholar Posidonius, examining his passage on earthquakes. Posidonius correctly states that the earth sometimes rises and sinks, and also undergoes changes from earthquakes and other similar phenomena. He aptly compares this with Plato's account that the story of the island of Atlantis may not be a mere fabrication. Plato states regarding Atlantis that Solon, having inquired of the Egyptian priests, reported that Atlantis once existed but disappeared. It was an island no smaller than a continent. There is nothing new in this passage. Both Posidonius and Strabo refer back to Plato's work, thus citing the single source on Atlantis. Seekers of Atlantis also reference the historian Claudius Aelian, who lived in the 2 and 3 RD centuries. Let's evaluate the reliability of his accounts. In his work, Various History, he recounts a conversation between King Midas, yes, the one who turned everything to gold with his touch, and Silenus, the son of the god Pan, and a nymph. Silenus tells Midas that there exists a vast continent in the Atlantic, inhabited by giants twice the height of a human. Once, in a number of 100 myriads, that is, 1,000,000, they invaded Europe and reached Hyperborea, but since they did not like it there, they returned home. You may think otherwise, but I refuse to accept this tale as evidence of anything. Finally, we come to the first more or less serious testimony in favor of Plato's account. It is found in the work of the Neoplatonist philosopher Proclus, titled Commentary on Timaeus, written in the 5th century. In his commentary, he analyzes the opinions of other scholars regarding Plato's dialogue Timaeus. Among others, Proclus cites the opinion of the philosopher Crantor, who lived in the 4 to 3 RD centuries BC. In his commentary on Timaeus, Crantor defended the reality of Atlantis and stated that the text mentioned by Plato had been preserved on ancient Egyptian stelae. Unfortunately, however, Crantor's work has not survived, making it impossible to verify the authenticity of this claim. On the other hand, other authors whose opinions are presented by Proclus hold an opposite view. According to another representative of the Neoplatonist school, Porphyry, who is supported by the Christian apologist Origen, the war of the Atlanteans with the pre-Athenian people is an allegory, symbolizing the struggle between spirit and matter. This brief analysis of ancient literature that we have conducted leads us to conclude that the claims of Atlantologists that someone other than Plato reported on Atlantis should be viewed with skepticism. Most authors either discuss a different Atlantis than the one Plato described or simply repeat his account. There were also opinions quite close to the conclusions we have reached in this study. For instance, Proclus noted that the Neoplatonist Longinus, who also examined the dialogue Timaeus, argued that the story of Atlantis illustrates Plato's ideas about the state. This interpretation was not only held by Longinus, many scholars of Plato's work shared it. Among them, one philosopher stands out whose testimony is of particular value, Aristotle. A younger contemporary of Plato, he was a long-time student of him and was well acquainted not only with his ideas, but also with his way of thinking. According to Aristotle, Plato used the description of Atlantis as a pretext for expressing his political views on the issue of the ideal state, adding that the one who invented Atlantis also sent it to the bottom of the sea. Well, I can only join Aristotle's assessment and conclude my account. Goodbye.